Okay, now let's start moving our components into their own folders. So the first thing I'm going to show you is actually our new folder structure. So we're actually going to have two folders. One for components, which is going to hold all of our reusable components, and one for our page components. So what's a page? Well, when you think about our home page, it's also a component, but it's a component that we're probably not going to use more than once. So any page that we make, I'm going to make a new component folder for it inside of our pages to separate it from our reusable components. So let's begin with our homepage component. And we're going to do component.jsx. And we're going to move our code here into our homepage. And then we're also going to copy our styles. And we're just going to move this into our homepage as well. Now, we don't need this anymore. And we have to update our app.js to point to the new location of our homepage component. So let's do pages, homepage component. Now, if we save, and if we make sure to save this as well, if we go back to our app, we should see everything is the same. Okay. Now let's start moving our directory and our menu item into their own components. So let's first start with our menu item component. So let's make a menu item folder in our components folder, and then make a menu item.component.jsx. Now we're also going to need those menu item styles. So let's make a menu item.styles.sass file as well. Let's copy over our menu item styles into our menu item styles.css. And then in our JS, let's import React from React. And for our menu item, we're going to use a functional component because we don't really need our component to hold any state, at least not for now. So let's start with a functional component. So let's do menu item equals a function that returns to us what we had in our homepage component. So let's just copy this over. Now, we probably want to be able to dynamically generate a title by passing a title into our menu component, right, as a props. So instead of doing something like props.title like this, we might also need some other properties to be passed in. If we look at our application, we're going to see that each one of these has a different image, right? So what we can do is we can actually destructure the title off of our props for now. And then we can just populate our component with that destructured value of title from our props. This is the exact same thing as writing props.title, except we're pulling that title value off of our props and then setting it to this title value inside of our function so we can use it whenever we want. And then let's export out our menu item. And now we have our menu items. Now, let's make our directory component. So let's make a directory folder. And inside, we will make our directory.component.jsx. And just like earlier, we'll also need a style sheet for this, directory.styles.sass. So let's copy over our homepage styles for our directory. Now, because we got the menu item, we don't need this anymore. So let's just get rid of it. But let's copy over our directory menu code into our directory sass. And then let's import React from React. And this one will need to be a class component because we do need to store the state value of those menu items that we want to pass and create our menu items with, right? So just like when we did our monsters Rolodex and we had that card list component, this one is going to have a directory with a state value of those menu items. So let's make a class of directory that extends React.component. And remember earlier, the first time we were actually importing it as a regular import from React, but this component class actually also exists on the React namespace that we import from React. So we don't even need to do an additional import. We can just do React.component. So inside of our directory class, we need that constructor, right? We always need our constructor. And inside of our constructor, we need to call super so that we pull in all the things we need from our React component into our class. And then we're going to set our state value, right? Now, because we're populating menu items, each of these menu items is kind of like a section, right? So I'm actually just going to call it sections. And that's going to be an array value that I have here for you in a different file. And what it is it's just an array of objects that have a title and an image URL. And the image URL is going to point to an image that's stored somewhere else online for these images. So inside of our render, we want to return what we had in our homepage. So let's go back to our homepage and let's copy this directory menu because that's all we really need. And now we want to map through our sections, right? And we want to pass these section objects into our menu item so that it can create the menu items. But let's also import our menu item component from our menu item component folder. And now we know that we have to pass in a function to our map call, right? So in our map call of our array, we're going to get a section. And what we want to render is the menu item. So there are many ways we can pass the props in, right? We know that we want a title, right? So if we wanted to pass the title, we could easily just do section.title. But what we want to do is, because we know we need this value, this title value, we know we need the image URL, and we want the ID for our key as well, right? What we can do, instead of doing this, which we have to type section every time, we can actually destructure all these values off of our section. So we're going to get the title, we're going to get the image URL, and we're going to get the ID. And now we can just do this. And now we have our ID and our title going in to our menu item. So let's make sure to export our directory. Okay, and then we got to make sure also to bring our style sheet in. So I think I didn't do that for our menu item either. So let's do that as well for our menu item. And then we got to go into our homepage and replace our old code with our new components. So let's go and import in our directory from our components folder, our directory, and then the directory component. And now we can replace all of this with just our directory. And if we go back, we should see that everything is the same. Awesome. Okay. Now, what about our images? Well, you remember in our directory, we had that image URL. So let's just pass that also into our menu item. So we're going to pass this image URL value into our menu item. And then in our menu item component, we are going to actually do something different. So React actually gives every one of these HTML markup elements another property called style. And style takes an object that has prop values equal to CSS values you want to apply to this element. So what we want to do is we want to set a background image, right? And these CSS values, instead of being the kebab case that we're used to seeing here, right, with the dashes, is going to be in camel case. And we want to set it equal to the image URL that we just passed into this component from our directory. What we got to do in order to make this work in CSS is we have to actually pass it as URL with the string interpolated value of image URL. And this is really awesome because this allows us to dynamically make styles on our components, which is super convenient because if this image URL change, right, our CSS value changes as well. And that's really cool. So we just have to update another style in our actual style sheet regarding what this background image URL is going to be, right? So we always want our image URLs to have that background image be centered and covering the whole div. So let's go into our menu item and let's do background position, right? We want it to always be centered. And then we want the background size to be cover. So we want our background image to cover the whole thing, and then the position should always be in the center. And now if we look, we see that our component has our images. But if we look at this, this is a little bigger as well, right, than these ones. So we know that these two need to be a larger size. So how do we do this? Well, typically in normal CSS, we could just add a class that would tell this component that it's larger, so it should have styles related to that. Well, we can do that as well with React. So inside of our directory, what we can do is we can actually pass in a size value, which is equal to large, right? And then we do that for our last two, for our men's and our women's sections. And then we can just pass that size value also into our component. And now on our menu item component, we can also dynamically add in our class name value right here, right? Because we're getting this size value, if it's nothing, it's not going to render anything. But if it is present, then we want to add it to our class name. So let's just string interpolate in that value with this, with size, right? And then we also always want it to have what we had earlier, which was menu item. And now, if we look at our menu item code, we also got to add in that style for it by doing ampersand sign. So if our menu item also has dot large, then we want to give it a larger height of 380 pixels. And now if we save and we go back, we see that our images, these ones are large, but these ones stay the same, right? They haven't changed. So that's one of the great things we can do with building out our components, is that we can use these properties and we can write JavaScript to give them a dynamically changing value so that it lends us a lot more flexibility when we're building and styling our components. Okay, now in the next section, we're going to style this menu item a little bit more with some of those transitions and some of these colors that we see in our final product.